I'll start with the question. What do we see when we think of women and mathematics in classical antiquity? Perhaps something like this. This is a Victorian painting of Hypatia of Alexandria. It was painted by Charles William Mitchell in 1885 and is now found in Newcastle upon Tyne. The title of this painting is Hypatia, New Foes with an Old Face. And it seems to have been inspired by a novel of the same title published in 1853 by Charles Kingsley. Hypatia of Alexandria is possibly the most famous woman mathematician of classical antiquity. Um, Not so much because of her mathematical contributions, which are not very well documented, but possibly because of her gruesome death, which is intimated here in this painting. Hypatia was active in Alexandria at the time of clashes between um, Christians and the pagans, or should we say, extreme fringes of Christianity and the pagan authorities. And she was killed very publicly in an act that has often been seen as the end of ancient philosophy and science, because it seems to have closed the period of discovery, of research, with a very violent act of negation and rejection, not just of pagan knowledge, but also of the fact that Hypatia was a woman. So her very violent and public death seems to have overshadowed her scientific accomplishments. What you see here in this painting, which is still, if you Google Hypatia, one of the first images that comes up, is nothing very much about her being a philosopher and a mathematician, but much more about her being a woman. Several elements of this painting are unrealistic. For a start, was Hypatia really blonde? This is, of course, a controversial point, but living in Egypt, speaking Greek, let's say that, this very Northern European looking body doesn't necessarily reflect what Hypatia really looked like, but possibly more the fantasies around her figure, harbored both by Charles Kingsley and Charles William Mitchell. Um, why is she in a church? The reports that we have indicate that she was killed possibly in the street. So the church is symbolic. It's more to convey the clash of religions, the clash of, to an extent, civilization, and really make a historical statement about Hypatia. Was her hair really that long? That's another element that we might come up with when we look at this picture. And what about her mathematics? It seems to take second place. As I said, there isn't a lot of detailed evidence about what Hypatia actually did as a mathematician. There are mentions of her work rather than actual passages or sections that can be attributed to her with any certainty. We know that she collaborated with her father, called the Theon of Alexandria, and we know that her father, Theon, had commented and possibly edited Ptolemy's syntaxis as well as Euclid's elements. We know that Hypatia probably wrote what we can call a commentary on Diophantus's work. Diophantus is sometimes called the father of algebra. So while we know that she was capable of very advanced mathematics, we don't really have anything much to show that we can with certainty attribute to her. This vagueness, this absence of detail, is what has also fueled the fictional episodes that we see in modern representations of Hypatia. This is a clip from a 2009 movie called Agora by Alejandro Amenábar, where Hypatia is played by Rachel Weisz. And it's only one of the several scenes in the movie where Hypatia is credited with revolutionary scientific insights, which are very, very unlikely. I am fascinated by a number of things in that scene. One is obviously the idea of Hypatia as a kind of a very early Galilei or maybe Copernicus, in that she performs an experiment with basically gravity, and discovers something centuries ahead of her time, which I think we can safely say she certainly didn't do. But another element that is also very interesting about that scene, and that to me is historically more accurate, is that unlike Galilei, who claims at least that he climbed the tower and dropped the weights basically himself, she has a slave do it, or an assistant to do it, who has to, despite being middle-aged, if not old, has to climb on this mast and drop this thing. So it reveals that Hypatia was certainly a wealthy woman. She had a lot of status, a lot of prestige. Her visibility was certainly behind also the hostility that she seems to have attracted, and her tragic death. And this is something that maybe the most visible women who did mathematics in antiquity shared. She wasn't the only one, even though she was the most famous. We know that the so-called Pythagoreans, or at least some of them, included women, and that their teachings included mathematics. So some women mathematicians from antiquity are associated with the Pythagoreans. But again, they seem to have had the leisure to be able to study and research and learn. We have a late ancient testimony that I wanted to briefly bring to your attention today, because it's not as well known as Hypatia or the Pythagorean women. What I'm showing you here is a manuscript, a 10th century manuscript in Greek, now in the Vatican Library, of a mathematical text written in Alexandria called the Collection, around the 4th century CE. So let's say a generation before Hypatia, maybe a couple of generations before Hypatia. The author is Pappus of Alexandria. According to some testimonies, Pappus was the teacher of Theon, the father and teacher of Hypatia. So there's almost like a direct genealogist. This is the beginning of book 3 of the mathematical collection. And in it, Pappus is addressing a woman called Pandrosion. The woman mathematician that is addressing has been teaching a solution to the problem of the duplication of the cube, which Pappus thinks is erroneous. So he spends the first part of book 3 demonstrating that this solution to the problem of producing a cube whose side is double the side as a given cube is not correct. What is remarkable is that the fact that Pandrosion is a woman doesn't actually get discussed much. It's as if it was pretty much a normal thing. It's not what Pappus decides to bring up to the reader's attention. Well, the reader is Pandrosion. The fact that Pandrosion was a woman, however, was noticed by editors, modern editors of Pappus, starting from the Renaissance onwards. And for quite a long time, This was seen as a mistake in the manuscripts. The name is where the arrow is. So the text was amended. So in philology speak, it was corrected to make Pandrosion a man, or to use the word that comes before it, gratis, like let's say, I don't know, most honorable, into a name of a man, because the philologists that were dealing with the text just couldn't cope with the idea that Pappus was addressing a woman mathematician. So there were women mathematicians in antiquity, not very many of them that we have evidence for. We don't know a lot about their actual contributions, which has led me in my research to try and find out whether we can go beyond the little evidence we have for people like Hypatia or the Pythagorean women or Pandrosion, and maybe cast our net a bit wider, asking not just about women and mathematics, but women and numeracy. In other words, we know that there weren't a lot of women doing mathematics, or at least we don't have the evidence for them. What can we say about women who may not have been able to do advanced mathematics, advanced geometry, but women who were numerate? Maybe women who could count, calculate, and measure, and maybe women who used this, shall we call it, functional numeracy, for their everyday life in their household at home, or for financial reasons, to contribute to the economy and so on. And when I basically changed the question from women and mathematics to women and numeracy, and started looking around for evidence, I found much more than I expected. And I think that this evidence can throw some interesting light, not only on the lives of ancient women, and not only on numeracy in antiquity, which is a very very little studied, but it can also tell us something about the relation between power and education, and the relative value of different forms of knowledge in antiquity and today. I'm going to go through a few points just as background to a more general study of numeracy, which has been the focus of my research for the last decade or so. I define a numeracy as the ability to count, calculate, and measure. I see it as part of mathematics, or related to mathematics, but it's obviously much more widespread than advanced mathematics. When I say the ability, I see that as a spectrum of abilities, a bit like literacy. So people can be more or less proficient in counting or calculating or measuring. Maybe we should talk in terms of numeracies. I'm keen to stress that literacy and numeracy, at least in antiquity, until I would say the late Middle Ages, were actually quite different. Why? Because when we talk about literacy in antiquity, we tend to talk in terms of orality. So things like reciting poetry, memorizing and delivering speeches, a whole dimension where words were performed, spoken, listened to, and so on and so forth. And then we talk about the written word. So, texts that were written that have come down to us on papyrus, on manuscript, on stone, and so on and so forth. When we talk about numeracy, there's a sort of extra dimension, which is not oral and is not written, but is something maybe a bit in between. And that is what one could call a performative dimension, linked to particularly calculation. Calculation in antiquity was almost always, I would say practically always, not written down, but performed with the use of instruments such as the ones you see here. So on the big stone slab on your right, and I'm sorry, this is the best picture I could get, is the so-called Salamis abacus. The date is pretty much possibly the 5th century BCE. It's very difficult to date these objects. It's in the National Museum in Athens right now, and it was found near Salamis, the island, which is why it's called the Salamis abacus. I don't know if you can make out that there are lines on this stone, and around the sides of those lines, there are also numerals in the acrophonic numerical notation that was used at the time. So this abacus is a counting board with the help of counters, and counters could be really any flat objects. It was used to add and subtract, and possibly also multiply and divide by Athenians, shall we say, or people in Attica at the time. The Salamis abacus is possibly the most famous counting board of antiquity, but it's one of a group of around 36 similar objects that have been found at different locations in the Greek world. The Roman counterpart is the bronze object at the bottom on the left. There aren't many of these that have survived. Bronze doesn't survive very well. There are around, I think, 6. And while the object is much smaller than the counting board in marble you see on the right, it kind of fits in the palm of a big hand. The principle is the same. You have lines, you have numerals, this time they're Roman numerals, and you have counters. I don't really have the time to go into how the calculations were performed, but there have been various reconstructions. And if you know anything about the Chinese style abacus or the Japanese style abacus, you can get a sense of how these two calculating devices may have operated. At the top, then, the last picture is a close-up of a relief from Trier in Germany, and it's an example of finger counting. Finger counting was counting more than calculating, but it's yet another example of what I've called the performative dimension of numeracy. So mental arithmetic, I think, was not really practiced. We don't really have evidence for it. It seems that counting and calculating and certainly measuring were actions, were sequences of actions that people performed, often, in fact, in quite a public context. Look at the finger counting image. This is one person who's counting a big heap of coins surrounded by a lot of other people. The Salamis abacus is large enough that more than one person may have stood around it to see how the calculations were being carried out. This embodied way of doing calculations and of indicating numbers on one's fingers is a dimension that literacy didn't have quite in the same way. So to me, this is a big aspect, a significant aspect that makes ancient numeracy quite different from ancient literacy. So with that in mind, let's move on to some case studies. I want to look at 3 case studies today of 3 women they're from different times and places, but I think they're united by their numerate abilities and what that numeracy meant for their lives. The first one that we look at is Archippe. What you see here is a bit of obviously a joke, and the woman on the bus is not Archippe. It's just there to give you an image from more or less the same period. Archippe was the wife of two of the most famous bankers in classical Athens. She was married first to a banker called the Passion, and then to another banker called the Formio. The dates we have for Passion indicate that his career must have started in the late 5th century BCE, when we know that he was enslaved. Passion was a slave to begin with, and working for his owners, who were called Antisthenes and Archestratos. Passion was not unique. We know that there were several institutions we could call, several firms we could call banks in classical Athens, and many, if not the most of them, employed slaves. Or at least the people who were slaves for part of their lives. Passion seems to have been very, very good at what he did. And he gained his freedom. So he moved from the status of being enslaved to the status of being freed, formerly enslaved. And later even acquired the Athenian citizenship, which is a rather outstanding example of social mobility. Banks at the time mostly worked in taking deposits for people and safe, keeping the money safe, but also investing that money into profit-making ventures such as naval, such as trading long distance, for instance. So we know that Passion, despite starting from the very bottom of the social scale, as a slave, went all the way to the top in terms of wealth. He was one of the richest men in Athens during the last part of his life. He acquired his former owner's bank. On his death, he had two sons who were underage. One of them was called Apollodorus, and he left his business to Phormio, the second husband of Archippe. Phormio, in his turn, had been a slave, and then had been freed by Passion. Passion's will also stipulated that his widow Archippe should marry Phormio. This is not was not as unusual at the time as it sounds now, because there was a strong sense that you should make provisions for the household, particularly if you had underage sons. And the best way to make sure that the business was, preserved, the livelihood of the two underage sons was preserved, was to not only transfer the business, but also transfer the widow, the wife. So Archippe ended up marrying Phormio as her second husband. Phormio, in his turn, also acquired Athenian citizenship. So because of their activities, we can speculate that both Passion and Phormio were numerate to a very advanced level. We know that they kept accounts. We know that they were able to calculate interest and currency exchange. And we know that they could estimate the profit and loss in a context of greater or lesser financial risk. Their success and their wealth also meant that they came into the public eye on more than one occasion, so that the main evidence we have about them comes in the form of court cases. Some brought against them, and some just mentioning them as associates of clients. So the passage I'm going to show you is from a speech by Demosthenes, written in defense of Phormio, in a case brought against Phormio, the second bank, by his stepson Apollodorus, the son of Passion, probably in 350 BCE. So Demosthenes here is talking about Archippe, the mother of Apollodorus. And he has a sentence which is very short, but I think carries a lot of meaning. He says that Archippe had an accurate knowledge of all these matters. Given that the court case is mostly about financial matters, I take this to mean that Archippe had accurate knowledge of the financial affairs of the house, of the household. See, this is an hypothesis. I don't have a smoking gun here, but sometimes if you find lots of small pieces, you can put them together and produce a possibly plausible image. We have another speech, probably by Apollodorus himself. Apollodorus was incredibly litigious, again mentioning Archippe, his mother. And he says, she lay sick, she was at the point of death, was unable to help in the depletion of my resources, is quite accusatory there. But the sentence I'm drawing attention to is when he says, she breathed her last, be no longer mistress of her property. This is very surprising because women were not supposed to be mistresses of their property. But the term that Apollodorus is using here of his own mother is curia, which is the weird, the strange female equivalent of the word kuros, which means the head of the household. The head of the household, legally speaking, officially speaking, has to be a man. So curia, the female version, is like one of those words that really shouldn't exist, if you see what I mean. But he still uses it because this is a situation that he says was happening, but legally we wouldn't expect to happen. And Archippe then is presented as knowledgeable about the financial affairs of a household which included one of the largest banks in Athens, and is said to be mistress of her property. Is it a step too far to suggest that she may have been numerate? We have other evidence from other speeches of widows from the same period in similar situations, if not maybe with so much money, where it's said that these women kept documents, grammata, on, or knew where the accounts were. Aeschines, in another speech, implies in a polemic context that the situation where a widow actually ran the household affairs was not infrequent. The term he uses for the woman the widow is talking about is hegemon, which is the term used sometimes for the Athenian Empire. So it seems plausible that in a society that was undoubtedly patriarchal and actually had the legislation to prevent women from administering or, having their own property, at the same time, a society where mortality and possibly especially male mortality was high, it seems plausible that widowed women may have often found themselves in charge of the household. When there was a household business, also in charge of the household business. I think that it is plausible, if not certain, to speculate that they may have had numerate skills as a means of establishing some control over their lives and looking after their family. The next and second example I'm going to look at very quickly, very briefly, is another widow, well, this widow in the for the document we look at, called the Babata. Babata was a Jewish woman who lived in the early second century CE. We have a whole archive of documents, papyri, relative to her household, and they've been found in a cave in today's Jordan near the Dead Sea. The documents are in 3 different languages. It's a trilingual archive: Greek, Aramaic, and Nabatean, a local language, they indicate as a whole that her life was quite eventful. She was married twice. Her first husband died, so she was a widow with a son from her first husband. Then married again someone who had another wife and other children. She may have died in the cave where several skeletons were found, as well as these documents. And the death may have taken place during a Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire. But the reason why she's included in this talk is because I think she's yet another example, and she's not portrayed here. This is an image from a different region, but of someone, a woman who was a teacher. Some of the evidence about the Babatha seems to indicate that she was financially savvy. So this is a passage from a papyrus from her archive, which reports court proceedings that Babatha brought against the guardians of her son from her first marriage. She went to the Roman authorities, which is an interesting move. The documents suggest that she tried to resolve the problem independently of the Roman authorities. So we can see this as a kind of, last resort of, escalating the situation. These are reported, the words reported here are supposed to be her own words. And she's talking about the fact that her orphan son has to live, it has to have a certain lifestyle commensurate with, the expectations of the family, the status of the family. But the guardians that have been appointed are not investing the money properly, so they're not getting as much interest on the wealth that they're administering on behalf of their orphan son as she could get. So the guardian is only getting 1/2 denarius per 100 denarii per month, but Babatha reckons in front of the Roman authorities that she could actually get a rate of a denarius and a half per 100 denarii, which is 3 times the interest that the guardians are getting. So this is definitely a woman who has her mind. She's financially savvy. And again, I speculate, we're not in the realm of certainty here, that this must have come with a good level of numeracy. She must have been able to work out how much she could make with her alternative financial plan to what the guardians of her son were doing. She has inherited property from her father, and so must have had quite a lot of experience in maybe administering her own affair. But one very interesting piece of information about Babatha is that one of the documents is signed on her behalf and indicates that she was illiterate, at least in Greek. She may have been illiterate in the other languages, Aramaic and Nabatean, but she is presented as illiterate. This is once again very, very interesting. And to me, it goes again to show that literacy and numeracy didn't necessarily go together. One could be highly literate and not very proficient with numbers. But on the other hand, one could also be able to count and calculate without being able to write, or at least not to the same standard. I move to the last example, which is again a papyrological archive, this time from the 4th century CE, relative to a mother and daughter, not depicted here, from a town in Egypt called Hermopolis Magna. They are called Aurelia Demetria, the mother, and Aurelia Charite, the daughter. It's an interesting mix of identities because they're Roman citizens. Everybody is at this point in the empire. They write in Greek, but there are indications from their archive that contains documents about their husbands as well, that there was also some Egyptian cultural identity in the family as well. They were extremely wealthy, and their husbands were very prominent in town. They had the office, they were part of the elite of Hermopolis Magna. They were once again very much in charge of their own affairs. This is the mother, Demetria, writing a payment order to her banker, Iraq, paying 4 talents, which is quite a high sum of money, to her daughter. What I like here, this is one of the pieces I always like to show my students. You wouldn't expect, when you hear things about women in antiquity, you wouldn't expect this to happen. A woman with a bank account sending money to her daughter, and quite a lot of it. No men are involved other than the banker Hira, who basically does what is told because she's the one who has the bank account at this particular bank. There are a lot of very interesting documents here, but one of the fascinating aspects is that both the mother and daughter are literate. They manage their own affairs. Here you have an arrow pointing to the signature of Aurelia Charite, who mentions an account. One of the documents in the archive may be an account in her own hand. And she also says explicitly in another document that she is literate and acting without a guardian by right of children. So she is benefiting from the so-called Ius Liberorum, a Roman law, she's a Roman citizen, that stipulated that if a woman, a free woman, had 3 children, she became legally autonomous. It's interesting that the fact that she's literate doesn't have anything to do with the Ius Liberorum, because it applied independently of whether she was literate or not. But she must have been quite proud of it. That's why I think she mentions it, as if to say, I can really deal with my own business. Incidentally, the word for literate, the phrase eudeia grammata, is the very same phrase that Demosthenes uses to talk about archippe. And grammata means written things, could be accounts. It doesn't need to be limited to written texts of other forms. So, conclusions. As I said, the literacy and numeracy didn't necessarily go together. That also means that the rates of numeracy may have been relatively high. Why do I think that? Because numeracy in certain situations was more useful than literacy. If you know how to count, it's, you have more of a chance of not being defrauded at the market, for instance. If you're a widow and you can read accounts, you can get a better sense of, your household finances. There is a correlation with status and wealth for women. When we move away from the gender aspect and look at men, I found quite high rates of numeracy amongst enslaved people. So I haven't found that intersection very much, but there are some interesting sources there that indicate that while literacy may have kind of gone in a certain way, numeracy operates a bit differently. As I said, there was a need sometimes in households, including, domestic economy, to have some financial numeracy to understand accounts. And it seems that with the women like Archippe, Babata, Aurelia Demetria, Aurelia Charite, who were quite wealthy, numeracy was certainly useful. We know that at least some of them were literate, and I think we can speculate that they may have been numerate enough to try and get some control and some autonomy, which was supported by those numerate skills.